Once again, we just want to thank everyone who's hung in with us throughout the day today for the 5th annual International Indigenous Peoples Cultural Conference. For those who may not be aware, the 5th annual International Indigenous Peoples Cultural Conference is an annual one-day conference featuring discussions, workshops, and presentations from cultural experts and academic experts, highlighting the diversity and complexity of Indigenous cultures throughout the world. The 2021 theme was International Human Rights, Indigenous Nations, and I think that should give you a little bit of understanding on why the conversations that we had today. And then our 2021 cultural honoring is the Polka Noki tribe and the 400th anniversary of the peace treaty signed with the Pilgrims. And for a recap, for those who may not have been here earlier, we started off with a welcome and land acknowledgement and a traditional blessing from our Polka Noki family. We then had greetings from chiefs and dignitaries, including Roger Williams University President Mialis, as well as State of Rhode Island Secretary of State Nellie Gorbea, and then the chiefs that are here in attendance as well. We then had special guest remarks from Lord Robert Orwell Thomas, very distinguished gentleman who announced that he will be taking on the paramount Lord Chief Justice position with the foreigner intertribal court system. So exciting stuff going on there, and you'll be hearing more about that in the near future. We then started off with our keynote address from Dr. Charlotte Carrington Farmer entitled Rethinking 1621, Historians and the Ethics of Centering Indigenous Voices. We followed that up with a panel discussion facilitated by ALSA Secretary Mario McLean entitled We Are the Polka Noki, featuring Sachem Poe, Anunks. I'm not chief, I'm gonna have to work on that. I'm trying though, I'm trying. Sagamore Poe, Happy Niampag, and Storm Turtle, all of the Polka Noki Nation. We then had lunch after that, followed up by a Mountain Hope Farmer Marker video presentation by Solemn's Heritage Project, and then a Lifetime Achievement Award, which was presented to the phenomenal Dr. Jeremy Banks by Dr. Charlotte Carrington Farmer and Sachem Wampamiquan from the Matakisa tribe. We just passed by the excellent presentation by Dr. James D. Diamond, Why I'm the Wrong Speaker for Today's Conference, In Search of My Replacement. And now we're moving on to our last portion of today's events, which will be our panel discussion entitled Treaties, the Law of the Land. So I've already given you background on Sagamore Poe Wapi Niampag. Let me introduce our other two panelists to you today before we get into our discussion. Chief, and it should be doctor as well, but we'll go with Chief, Ronald Yanaguska Drowning Bear Holloway is the principal blood chief of the Sandhill Band of Lenape and Cherokee Indians. Chief Holloway was appointed by tribal council and followed his father, Medicine Crow, who was the principal chief before him. Chief Holloway holds 7 different finance and security licenses and worked for Edward Jones Investments as a financial advisor, handling the sales and purchases of stocks, bonds, mutual fund currencies, commodities, and insurance. Chief Holloway also served as a police officer in Los Angeles County and is a veteran of the armed forces. Chief Holloway holds a doctorate of divinity and was a committee member of the BOE-MRE, New Jersey Department of Energy, Renewable Energy Task Force under President Obama. Chief Holloway was also a NGO representative to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, a committee member on the NGO Working Committee of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, formerly held a seat on the advisory panel of the Native American Children's Museum of New York, New York, and has attended meetings as a regular featured speaker on Native American traditions and customs with the United States Customs and Border Patrol. Chief Holloway was a guest speaker at the World Health Organization to discuss issues affecting female Native Americans. And in November of 2009 was the keynote speaker for the Healing Turtle Island event hosted by the Dutch Reformed Church in Manhattan, New York, intended as a public formal apology and reconciliation from the church to the Lenape people and Delaware Nation. Chief Holloway is a chartering signatory chief of the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas, FANA, and currently serves as FANA's international ambassador. Round of applause for Chief Holloway. And then the incomparable Dr. Taino Palermo has spent the last 15 years working to address issues in policy and practice in the areas of nonprofit management, community and economic development, urban education, and neighborhood revitalization. He is also known to his people as Amagawatu, which is Taino for fire, river of fire, and is the cacique or chief of the Baramaya Guanea clan of the Taino Indian Nation, native to the Guanea region of Borican, known today as Ponce, Puerto Rico. Until 2019, Dr. Palermo was the director both of the Community Development and Healthy Communities degree programs at Roger Williams University's University College in Providence, where he founded the state's first and only graduate program in community development. Dr. Palermo is currently a second-year law student at Roger Williams University School of Law, where he serves as the founding president of the American Indian Law Students Association. And Amagawatu also serves as the Deputy Director General for the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas. Please, everyone, a round of applause for Dr. Taino Palermo. And I'm only not going into his extensive background because I already did it. Round of applause for the Sagamore Co-op Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas. So I think if anyone's ever known me before, when I host these panels and discussions, I have a nasty habit, which tends to be intentional, of not preparing our guests for anything, and then just throwing a bunch of questions at them. So I'm not going to change my nature today. And I think that me too, Mr. Lewis will tell you that I even get a little kick out of doing it to people. So knowing how accomplished and capable our panel is, we're going to start with the very Sagamore of these lands that we're in. Sagamore Superior Chief, would you be so kind, sir, as to share with our audience who's paying attention what the importance of the Polka Pilgrim Treaty was, not just to the Polka people, but to America as well?
You want to?
I would like you to speak, sir.
Oh, you want me to stand up?
No, you can get your mic right there.
Okay. Oh, yes. Well, thank you for that introduction. Treaties are not my expertise. However, I can elaborate on the fact that there were quite a few extenuating circumstances that led up to the Massasoit making that treaty. Previous to that signing of that treaty, you had the events of the Great Dying, and that everyone, they talk about that 1619. They give that year because that was a year before the Pilgrims got here. But that was a process that lasted about 4 or 5 years and wiped out 90% of his tribe. Previous to that, you had these tribes from up north come down here, the Tarratans, and they swept on through the Massachusetts Nation. They swept through the Wampanoag Nation, and on their way back, they went through the Narragansett Nation and wiped out. They were pretty fierce tribe as far as war was concerned. And you had all these events that led to the depletion of our people. The Great Dying wiped out entire villages, the village of Squanto, Patuxent, where the Pilgrims landed. That was wiped out completely. The only reason why Tonto was alive is because he was taken captive and enslaved over to Europe. Before he made his way back here, his people were all gone. It was so devastating that at the time, these people were dying. They didn't even have a chance, time to bury the dead. They were dying. They were just laying all over the landscape. So it was advantageous to the Massasoit to get into a peace treaty because he was a diplomat. I think he was way ahead of his time. When you stop and think about the things that these tribes fought over, mostly it was land, territory. And previous to the previous to that plague hitting his people, he had amassed an enormous amount of territory, according to the repositories of the Ivy League institutions. His territory went all the way up to Schaghticoke Falls, the side of the Hudson River, southern New Hampshire, and southeastern Mass, and parts of present-day Rhode Island. When you start to talk about Solmes at that time was part of Massachusetts. In 1747, Plymouth, Massachusetts ceded the land of Solmes to the state of Rhode Island, but before that, that was all part of Massachusetts. As far as Cumberland, all of that area going up north into Woonsocket and whatnot, that was all part of Attleboro Borough. That was part of Bristol County, Mass. And so there's a man that, lost his fighting force, 3,000 warriors. He said he could amass 3,000 warriors at one time, and he ended up with 300 warriors. And to be able to still be Massasoit, the great leader of this big nation, and still bring these people to a peace-signing treaty. And there's a lot of these chiefs that signed that treaty were from that Nipmuc nation, his relatives, because his wife was queen of the Nipmucs. And they don't talk about this, but there was a means of survival for him because he was warring with the Narragansetts, and the Narragansetts were warring with the Pequots, and all of these things were going on, and he needed protection now himself because he didn't have that fighting force. And for the Pilgrims, it ensured their survival. If it weren't for that peace treaty, and they kept that peace treaty for 54 years. 54 years. It wasn't until his son Philip Polka became the Massasoit that he determined that he wasn't sharing his land anymore, he was losing it, and that he'd rather die than be without a country. And that's why he went to war. But that ensured the Pilgrims being able to sustain being in this territory. And he did this even though some of the Sagamores and sachems under him, they didn't want him to allow the English to stay. So hindsight, they say it's 2020. What happened? We honored the treaty. They did. Greed took over, and we are where we are today. I do believe, though, if these judges would adjudicate the cases that come before them and did it honestly, that we wouldn't be in the predicament we are in today. As far as that's concerned, because they're not doing their job. And so the peace treaty in 1621 was a means of survival for the Massasoits. That's what it comes down to. And he maintained that by soliciting the help from the colonists.
Thank you very much, Zach. I'm gonna go down to the end of the table to our international ambassador. Chief Yanagos of Lenape were the first nation to sign a peace treaty with the United States. And from that, all sorts of things happen that are in disrepute in history. Could you share a little bit about the Lenape history with treaties and the important role that they played in the work that you're engaged in today?
Well, the Lenape people are very honorable. We believe in keeping our word. Our handshake is good enough. Unfortunately for us, we had a similar experience in dealing with colonists. We took it at face value. We made a treaty with them. And as is the case with the old joke that 1,000 treaties signed, 999 broken, they dishonored it. We currently still hold 2 open treaties, one of which guarantees us, was guaranteed at that time that we would be the 14th state after the Revolutionary War. We fought with honor alongside the colonists, George Washington, as did Sagamore's relatives, only to have our relatives, my ancestors, marched off afterwards. Rounded up the Cherokee, they came up, they took the Delaware and took them out to what I refer to as the Great Sandbox in the Midwest. One of the things that Sagamore had touched on earlier, in order for us to survive the misfortune of honoring our treaty with the English, we had to hide. We were light-skinned, we hid in the lighter communities. If we were darker skinned, we hid in the darker communities. We held our family gatherings, and that's how we kept our tribes together. We passed these traditions around orally. We kept our crafts and our culture. But as everybody on the East Coast knows, it was illegal for a long time to be native in the east of the Mississippi. It was, you were snatched up unceremoniously and drug away. And that really didn't change till fairly recently. A few chiefs before me, Lone Bear Reedy, one of my favorite chiefs, not that I need to pick a favorite chief, he actually was the official spokesman for the Delaware Nation east of the Mississippi. He was a very fine man who believed in honoring the old ways, but the treaties that the Lenape have made have been dishonored, and the vast majority of our extended families are on reservations, and I like to always point out that reservations are not Indian land. Reservations are federal land that are reserved for the federal government to use as they wish. And because of that, it's a very tenuous situation. The Lenape are keenly aware of the issues with honoring treaties. And these treaties, as the Sagamore said, here we are today. I don't even need to repeat that because everybody in attendance has the exact same experience. You go with honor and you don't get treated that way. And then the successor government, which is this particular case, the United States, has a policy of not honoring the treaties, even though they're enforceable. It's just a sad state of affairs. So our experience with them is the same as everybody else's. It's brutality, it's genocide, and wow, that's about all I can say. Just wow.
Thank you very much, Chief. CK Fire River. The Taino people were the first indigenous nation of people in the Western Hemisphere to have a treaty with a colonial power, that being Spain. And I know that you're now in law school with me, exploring a lot of these elements and how they tie into contemporary law and how it applies to indigenous peoples. From your perspective, how do treaties impact Taino people? How is it different from some of the story that we heard from Yanaguska and Ho'api'ilima? And where do you think that treaties can best fit into the work that you're doing for Taino people today?
Well, I think first is to remember that treaties are a mechanism for the white man to get access to Indian lands and communities. It's, you know, we talk about them in the context of an agreement of sorts, or a contract between two parties, when in actuality they are an allowance of the white man to access Indian lands, and to our devastation by thinking that we were bartering with fair and equal parties. And so what adds the complexity for Tainos and indigenous people who are native to what are American colonies, it's a very complex situation because, you know, for example, Borinquen, as we know, as Puerto Rico, did not become a territory of the U.S. until 1899. So what's happening, or 1898. So what's happening in mainland North America at that time was kind of the end part of the devastation that the other chiefs are referring to. We're now talking 50-ish, 100 years of oppression. So by the time the US acquires Hawaii, acquires Borinquen, and Virgin Islands, where the Chamorros are, and all these other territories, they had already mastered the game of colonization. And so what happens is in the Spanish crown, in Puerto Rico in particular, didn't have any treaties with Tainos, but they enumerated them in their census. They wrote vigorously about them, many times in ways that was intentionally underreporting their existence to give a public perception of Spain's dominance, but also to justify to the crown why they needed to import more African slaves who the Spanish colonizers believed were more apt to deal with the intensive slave labor that they imposed. And Tainos weren't generationally accustomed to that in the way Africans unfortunately were. And so they would often kill Tainos or enslave them to death in order to import more African slaves. And where this most, getting to Two Hawks' question, where this most kind of comes to a head is in Quisqueya, which we know today as modern day Dominican Republic and Haiti, where the infamous Taino cacique Enriquillo signed the first treaty with Spanish colonizers because they, people think of Spain colonizing all of Quisqueya as an island, but they really only colonized the eastern half of that island, Dominican Republic side, and of that half was the coastal side where Santo Domingo is, and a lot of the coastal properties. As you moved into the mountainous rainforest area, which was where Enriquillo's clan lived, it became more treacherous for the colonizers to try and oppress them. And so after numerous battles, by the late 1500s, they realized, we can't do this anymore. They're not going to give up their land and allow us to subjugate them. So they entered into the first peace treaty known to Tainos. Now Spain occupied Quisqueya as well as Borinquen, and in the Paris Treaty at the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, Spain essentially gifted as pirate booty, of the war. It was like spoils of the war, these territories, and so Puerto Rico became a territory of the U.S. And you can actually Google this. I mean, it's on the census website. The first report done by the War Department of Puerto Rico enumerates. It has an entire section of Aborigines and Tainos, and talks extensively about the Tainos. In 1910, they issue a new census, a new report, and name and redefine the word native. And so native is anyone who was born on the island. Doesn't matter what hue or what genetics or what indigeneity you had. If you were born on the island, you were considered a native. By 1917, they implement the Jones Act, which naturalizes everyone. And so now you're a US citizen. There's no differentiation in classification. And let me just back up. In 1900, they implemented an insular government, which means no recognition of any sort of tribal government that may exist, which did. And during the oppression of Tainos in Puerto Rico, what elders tell us is that all the communities who fled enslavement settled in the mountains. And you could go to Puerto Rico today, and dead smack in the middle of the island in Utuado and Jayuya, the city signs, there's everything is Taino-esque. And so elders' stories, as well as documented history, all shows that we fled enslavement and therefore were written out of history because we didn't impose ourselves, insert ourselves. The Sagamores mentioned this earlier about, putting our history in the Smithsonian. The museum in Utuado is, for all intents and purposes, really just a symbol. You walk inside and it's dioramas of Taino relics, because all of our stuff are in major commercial museums. And so we don't even, we don't even have access to our cultural relics. And because of the way the US was so advanced in their colonization game, by the time it came to us, there's a roadmap called the Northwest Ordinance. And that roadmap really sets up the US government's operating procedure of when they take over a territory, implement a colonial government, and then you petition the federal government to be a state. And so as they were expanding Western United States, that was the kind of playbook in the 1700s. Now you're talking, if you look at a map of the United States in 1898, the continental United States pretty much looks like how it is right now, with the exception of the territories. So just to give you an idea of, 1898 sounds like a long time, but in terms of advanced colonization, the US was the Michael Jordan of the game, so to speak. And so by the time it came to the colonization of Puerto Rican and Puerto Ricans and Hawaiians, Hawaiians will tell you this as well, it became very clear it needed to be a congressional statute, needed to be a federal, sweeping legislation, naturalize everyone. And we don't even have a conversation about indigeneity or tribal governments. It's just everyone becomes a citizen. And so that makes it a little tricky for us to, because it's kind of, if you could imagine the federal government's response is like, well, you didn't make yourselves known. Well, you don't have a treaty like the other ones do, right? And so you didn't claim your lands. And so that, kind of leads to the point now is why we're in law school and why we're doing nation building work for Tainos who are all over. People were private messaging me in the chat about where they are across the country and building and stuff. And so we are here, we've never left. And just because we don't have a treaty doesn't mean we are not entitled to our land and our rights as Indigenous people.
Very good. Thank you very much, Chief. I'm going to come back to the Superior Chief and the Sagamore. And this is in reference to a comment that Chief Yanaguska made. And the only reason I'm not asking Chief Yanaguska this question is because I have another one for him after this. But Sagamore, Superior Chief. Article 6, Clause 1 of the United States Constitution says, all debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of the Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation. How should that be applied to Indigenous nations with treaties today?
Before the Constitution?
I'll read it again, sir. All debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of the Constitution shall be as valid against the United States under this Constitution as under the Confederation.
Oh,
How should that be applied to Indigenous nations today?
We should have any debts. Well, anything that you find in that article, it applies to us. So therefore, we should have any debt. We shouldn't be paying taxes. We should, there's a lot of things we shouldn't be doing that we are doing, and that's the reason why we took in Form Fauna. That's the reason why you gentlemen are going to law school, and we're forging this fight, this battle. One of the things we've done, and you're talking about those laws, they apply to us. They apply to us because we're Aboriginal. We're the original inhabitants of this land, and we don't come under their laws. Therefore, we're free of that. They apply to us. One thing I have a problem with is, we talk about the treaties and things of that nature there, and we've even gone so far as to write the Pope. Because that, what Dr. Taino was talking about, that doctrine of discovery, that was one of the main reasons that we're in the predicament we're in. And basically, they did to the Taino nations before they came here. They perfected it when they came here. But what they did to them was even worse, you know. And now that the Pope comes over here, and supposedly was a couple of years back, the Pope came to the United States.
Yeah, well,
And he supposedly had rescind the doctrine of discovery. So why haven't they given us back our land? Huh? I mean, you know, really, I mean, the Catholic Church is as much at fault as his government, because they're the ones that caused this problem to begin with. And I say that they're all going to answer to a higher authority. You know, if they don't believe there's a creator, there is a creator, there's only one. They'll answer to a higher authority. But that when that doctrine was rescinded, these people are supposed to be giving it back. They're supposed to be returning this land to us. You know, they took it from us. And if you look at their lands, they're all prime properties on water. And wherever you go, and they're giving up this land because people are just not supporting these religious foundations as they were. And they're closing down these monasteries, and they still don't offer it to the indigenous people. And that's the same thing with the United States government. When they close down these bases, those bases should be returned to the indigenous people. So they're talking about it, but they're not doing it. They speak out of both sides of it.
Thank you, sir. Let's go down to Chief Yanaguska. Chief, as International Ambassador for FANA, you've been point on establishing relationships with international nations, and have actually kind of been the facilitator of the formation of at least 2 treaties with the sovereign Polynesian Kingdom of Tu'i. Sir, would you just share a little bit about your current work on behalf of FANA and the importance of establishing new treaties between indigenous nations in terms of cementing our sovereignty in contemporary society?
It's a big question. I think it's in order to understand it, you have to understand the context of true sovereignty. In particularly, what the United States would grant to incorporated and trust fund tribes as opposed to true actionable sovereignty. Actionable sovereignty is complete control over your lands, your people, your resources, and the like. And truly sovereign people, nations, can only do treaty with truly sovereign nations. You cannot do treaty as a sovereign nation with a corporation. So it's important to differentiate that. Permission to speak freely.
Absolutely, Chief.
Sometimes I answer things that are a little broader in scope than everybody wants. So you have to understand that the primary mechanism that has been used throughout the centuries is the legal tool that's referred to as the trust. And the trust is, in the United States, you deal with primarily 4 types of trusts, but the 5th one that gets skipped the most is called the ghost trust. Well, normally that doesn't get moved much in the law firms because it's not a terribly lucrative trust for 4th. But there's an even more superior trust. And those trusts sometimes are referred to as master trusts, or in the case of the context of what I'm talking about is specifically referred to as the God Trust. And these trusts are for those of us on the eastern seaboard, primarily, let's call it from the Carolinas north, when the sovereigns came through, they took our lands, referring to us as children. And they took those lands, they did treaty, and then they took those lands and put them into a master trust. Those master trusts are still in effect. They're in effect in Europe, and they're primarily for the individuals that are here representing their peoples. Those trusts are primarily located in the sovereign city of London. The problem when understanding true treaty and how to move FANA forward has been trying to identify those tribal nations that truly have the right to enter into treaty with us. As we are the treaty holders, the descendants or the successionary heirs to the tribal nations that existed at the time of the treaty signing. So when you're looking at access to those specific European trusts that are still there, the only people who can access those trusts are the individuals or their descendants or their successor heirs that were signatories to those treaties at the time of their signing, not subsequent, but before. So it's up to and before are the only ones who can claim access to those individual trusts. So for FANA, the delicate nature that we've had in finding adequate people to enter treaty with is separating who is inside a trust, who has the right to sign a treaty, who can enforce their treaty, which is not really understood inside the United States, because when you have tribes that are, we'll call them federally recognized, and I'm not taking away from them, I'm just looking at a legal status. Those tribes that are in the quote-unquote federally recognized status with BIA, those individual tribes are inside a trust that the United States manages. Okay, so now you have a tertiary issue, because you have a nation that technically no longer has its sovereignty, exists in a trust that's owned by the United States. Most of the United States appendages are corporations. They're chartered in Puerto Rico and the territories. So we can't, without giving up our status, enter into treaties with a lot of the tribes in the country, because they don't have the sovereign right to do it, because the United States determines what they can do with the money that they earn, where their lands are. In most cases, for the eastern seaboard tribes, the tribes that have federal recognition aren't on their lands. The reason being is because the United States has never, ever had control of those lands, because originally they were placed into trusts. So since those trusts still exist, we have a delicate task. So sovereignty becomes the true issue for FANA in going forward. We've done some very good things with the Hawaiians. We've got some stuff that you're going to announce that we're going to be signing shortly with some very large confederations outside of the United States. These entities truly have sovereignty. So our quest has been to make sure, not so much as we are in league with other natives, because we truly have an understanding and a sympathy towards where they're at, and a commonality in the genocidal slaughter the United States put us through. But we can't sign with them, because if you look at some of the flags, it'll say Papadam Inc. And the ink is done. You're not truly sovereign anymore. So my father used to call it elephant medicine. As you walk, it's kind of one big step, boom, and you look around, and then you take the next step. So we have we're interested in quality as opposed to quantity. We're interested in genealogy. We're interested in true legal status. Do they have the right to sign with FANA or the Polka Noki? So damage can be done by being in a haste to get nations to go, ooh, yeah, they recognize it. We're not, and anybody can recognize you or dismiss you. And as Sagamore was saying, I had this discussion, it was 3 weeks ago on an Indigenous Global Leaders Conference. There was 100 different global leaders from around the world. And I made the point, as one of the federally recognized tribes chimed in and said, how do we know that you are recognized by the federal government? The answer that I gave was, we're not interested in your recognizing us. We will never produce our documents to you. We just are. And when the time is right, we will produce the documents that are necessary in the correct legal format. So we have made some good alliances. When you look at FANA and the ones that we're signing, that we've already signed, we're well established throughout Polynesia and the islands. We've got good alliances now that we're getting ready to move on throughout the Commonwealth. And we've had some contact with other former British colonial indigenous in Asia and other countries, and we're comparing notes. What do you know about X? Oh, yeah, well, in our conversation, when we went to the Sovereign City of London, we had this conversation, here's the documents. We're in that kind of treaty building alliance going forward, because we want to make sure that the steps that we make, as it was pointed out earlier by Professor Diamond, just because you start the process doesn't mean you're going to be around to finish it. But what we're looking to do is move the ball and find adequate support mechanisms and successors to move that information to. So we have a different approach. And because of that, it takes a lot longer, but I'm very happy with the tribes and the tribal leaderships that we've come in contact with and the documents that they've produced. Because one of the founding understandings of FANA is we are all truly actionably sovereign, which requires a different game plan than everybody else. We're not waiting for a paycheck. We don't need permission. We just are by the fact that we are still here. We didn't go anywhere. And now that the technological advances have been had, not that the pandemic currently isn't bad, but I will tell you from my standpoint, it's caused a lot of indigenous leaders to sit still, which has given me access to people who would normally be on the road doing this, hop on a plane, being Sagamore, hop on a plane, go here. They're all stuck at home. And we decided that we were going to bypass the permanent forum at the United Nations and build a much larger organization that is not subject to the same colonial powers that run the United Nations. It's a new face, but the Security Council is the same sovereign colonial powers. So where are we ever going to find justice inside the United Nations when the same colonial powers are like, you're not real? Well, obviously we are, we're here. Look at the Sagamore's binder. But, you know, this is a serious consideration because the fact that we're still here and they failed at genocidally erasing us means now they have to deal with us. And the preservation of the documents is infinitely important. I know to get our documents secure, we went old tech. We put it on data sticks, and I literally went to Starbucks, went into the bathroom, left it on top of a toilet tank, and had somebody come in and pick it up for me and mail it off to another continent. That's the level of forethought that we have to have in family. So we're moving forward very, very well, and I'm actually quite not only pleased, but really tickled at some of the announcements that you're going to get to make next week, because we're putting together an overarching government that has a function of a true confederacy, not too dissimilar from the United States or how the United Nations works, except more equitable. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for sovereign, equitable partnership that have the ability to honor treaties and the willingness to honor those treaties. We're not interested in just friends and looking good on Facebook or whatever. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, Chief. Thank you for those very, very good words. We're gonna leave our last question for the CK Fire River, and then we will look at some of the questions that have been posted in the chat. And I really want to bring this contemporary, actually tie in some of the work that the good doctor is involved in right now. So we're sovereign. We've got our treaties amongst the founding member nations and these other nations, but we still need to figure out how we actually get our lands back under our control. Doctor, would you kindly share some of the work that you've been doing this past semester, just on one of the few strategies that Indigenous nations in the capacity that the Founding Member Nations are in could utilize in order to actually regain control of their actual lands?
Sure, and I'll be brief for the selfish reasons of publication on this legal framework that I'm putting together. But essentially, as Chief Yanagusa mentioned earlier about tribes west of the Mississippi, what we have to also understand is that a lot of these tribes west of the Mississippi were relocated there. And so these are originally Eastern Seaboard tribes, and those who weren't relocated had to hide or rename themselves or assimilate willingly or unwillingly. And so the question becomes, under American Indian law, what are the pathways to reclaiming your land? And so it's a convoluted situation, but also, as Yanaguska mentioned, the Federal Reserve lands that exist today, as we know them as reservations, are lands that are held in trust, managed by the federal government. So what that means, the legal term is that these tribal nations who live on these reservations do not have the property right to alienate that land, which means they can't sell it or do anything with that land that other property owners would do when they buy any piece of property. And without getting too legalese, the term is to own property in fee simple, which essentially means that's the highest level of property possession. I mean, that means you can do with it what you want. You can sell it, you can mortgage on it, you can do whatever you want with that land. And so when you think of federal reservations, think of them as, in legal terms, as national parks. They're protected lands. The difference is those lands are operated by tribal nations. And so that creates a separate jurisdiction, separate laws, but everything is beholden to the federal government. So the question becomes, how do landless, federally unrecognized tribal nations reclaim their lands? And so the theory is pretty basic when you think about it. It's actually leapfrogging or just going around the convoluted nature of American Indian law and operating under what existing property and trust law. So, for example, if I were to buy as Taino Palermo, a US citizen, a piece of property in Ponce, Puerto Rico, where I am bloodline ancestral to, can prove it, can document it under any legal US made provision, whether it's blood quantum or historical documentation or being held out as an Indian and recognized by other Indians. Name your US made, as Dr. Diamond referenced, legal provision. We check those boxes, but we don't have a treaty and we're not recognized. So if I were to buy that piece of property in my ancestral lands, gift that property to the tribe in trust, the tribe now owns that property in trust, in fee simple, under their own laws. Now, the difference is Taino or Joe Schmo as a US citizen could never do that unless that person, like myself and my people, are ancestral to those lands. So Joe Schmo can't go to Ponce, buy land off the free market, and then the next day institute a tribal government and tribal police and say this is Indian country, because Joe Schmo is not ancestral to those lands. So if my people were to do that and buy something off of Zillow, for example, and buy a piece of property and then transfer that property in trust to the tribe to be managed by the tribe. A trust is merely a legal instrument where you protect assets for the benefit of a third party. And so if we are buying that land, gifting it to the tribe manages it for the benefit of tribal members for time immemorial, then that land has been converted into a quote unquote Indian country. Although that's a bad term to name it. I'm just naming it that so you have a sense of reservation, like the transfer process. But Indian country legally means reserved lands under the jurisdiction of the federal government. But I say that just to understand the transfer process. And so if I, as a private US citizen, like anybody else can, buy a piece of property and give it to the people who are ancestral to those lands, indigenous to those lands, and they implement their own tribal government, they operate under a constitution, they have an enforcement division, whether it's tribal police or some sort of judiciary to enforce those tribal laws. They put the federal government, the Puerto Rican government on notice. We are here, we are protecting these lands, we are sovereign, we are announcing ourselves to the world. Who's gonna stop them? That's the question. Why can't they do that? And I think the introduction of this legal framework sparks that conversation, because that will piss someone off. And so someone will have to figure out, how do we stop these Indians from figuring out how to hack the game that we thought we built around them that they couldn't do? Because now we're not federally recognized. So we operate in property purchasing and selling like any other US citizen. If you bought a piece of property in the middle of Oklahoma or wherever as a big farm, and you chopped that big farm up into 6 different properties and sold one there and leased that, and no one could tell you to do that because you own that in fee simple. And so the difference is, when you take a land into trust for the federal government, you no longer have fee simple ownership. You're like a tenant paying rent to a landlord. The only difference is that you can knock down your apartment building and build a different one if you want, but the landlord has to sign off. So where this legal framework is different is that it's really just trying to circumvent the ambiguity and convoluted nature of American Indian law and kind of flip the game against them. The only difference is that this legal framework could only be applied by the people who are indigenous to those lands, because the transition from like private American legal property to tribal lands recognized as sovereign land almost creates, it's like reverse colonization, if that makes sense. It almost creates a foreign government within an existing nation state, except that foreign government is actually the indigenous people of that land. Instead of petitioning the federal government through the Indian Reorganization Act section, I think it's 465, that says you can petition the Secretary of Interior to take lands into trust, I think up to $2 million per fiscal year, still keeps you bound by the federal government. So maybe we can get a reservation in Ponce, Puerto Rico, but we would be no different than any other federally recognized reserved lands. And we can't alienate that land. We can't economically develop that land unless the federal government signs off. But if I buy that land as a private citizen and then gift that land to my tribal council who oversees the land for the benefit of the tribe, and they own it in fee simple, who can tell them they can't do that? They not only legally own it, but they are also the bloodline indigenous ancestral occupants of those lands. And so I think it just opens up an interesting intersection of international law, property law, trust law, American Indian law. And so, I look forward to kind of stress testing this.
Yes, Chief Yanaguska.
If I could dovetail with that's a very important concept, because one of the things that FANA provides for each of the members in our reaching out to other confederations When you take a look at the United States common law, it refers to the list of things that qualify you as a truly sovereign people. And it's the interaction between federal, state, local officials, business leaders, and then the big bracket is recognition amongst other peer tribes. So what FANA is doing is we are cross-recognizing each other as truly sovereign. And then this sovereign body is cross-recognizing with other larger confederations of 10, 15, 20 tribes. And now you're talking about 40, 50 tribes that recognize each other. And when you tie in Polynesia and you have all the islands, like some of the signatories on our Polynesian tribe are the sovereign, from Tahiti and Guam and all those places we're in treaty with because they're the blood chiefs. They're the I am for their people. So it's exactly what the good doctor was saying. It's a very interesting strategy. And everybody in FANA is coming together with big chunks of these pieces. And then the chiefs are sitting around sewing together this fabulous tapestry of, oh, okay, we got to do that. And it takes a little bit longer. But when it's done, it'll be done correctly. And it'll be a beautiful thing to see.
Round of applause for our panelists. Excellent to be able to be taken all the way from the first point of contact with European colonists up to strategies that could be put in place today. And to me, that really kind of captures the whole essence of the International Indigenous Peoples Cultural Congress. We want to show the diversity. We don't want to just stay stuck in history books. ECEI has a concept that we've embraced that we call living culture. Here now, today, in your face. I wear my skins and feathers and all that, but I got a pair of jeans on as well. And I'm going to law school, and treat me like I'm a real human being. Don't treat me like I'm a caricature or something that used to be here. And this is what the Sagamore was talking about with a lot of the writings that go on today. They write about us because it's becoming more fashionable to write about us, but consistently as if we used to be there. And as a result, we're not here now. So appreciate all of the chiefs. I just want to open it up in a few minutes we have left to anyone from our audience that has any questions. And there is at least one question from the chat. So if no one has any questions from the audience, I'll take a look at this chat question before we close out today. And then I will remind all of the chiefs in the room. First of all, we're going to say all of the participants today, please don't leave. Then we're going to say all of the chiefs, please don't leave. Then we're going to say everyone who's here, please don't leave. We need to get pictures because we got to show this stuff off. So any questions from our audience? And if not, I'll check into our chat. Okay. We have a question from Marcus of Titicut. And the question is, under fee simple ownership, would the land still be taxable by the U.S. if an indigenous person buys land on their ancestral land and puts it into a nation?
Well, that's it becomes taxable like any other property is taxable until it's transferred over. And once it becomes transferred over, so you got to understand, this is what I'm proposing. I haven't read anything about, and I read a lot for those who don't know. And so this is why I'm trying to propose this. And so I think to answer that question, you start getting into the taxation of trusts and estates. And so under that body of law, that's why I said this process essentially creates a foreign nation within a nation state. And so tribal trusts, especially as adopted under the Hague Convention, is seen as any other trust mechanism. So for U.S. taxation purposes, my theory kind of frames it as a foreign trust, which are tax exempt under U.S. taxation law. So a foreign trust is any trust that generates income predominantly through foreign mechanisms. And so, if this framework in motion, in theory, could entice foreign investments into our lands for the purposes of economic development, which which in turn would be foreign derived income on this trust, which is not taxed. So that's the theory. We'll let you know how it plays out in practice.
Absolutely. Yes, Sagamore.
Yeah, what about the, if we're categorized as an Indian not taxed status?
Sure.
Why are we paying taxes if the Internal Revenue
Well, because
agrees
they,
to that status?
you know why, Sagamore? Because once the truth is in their face, they play the ostrich game and duck their heads in the sand, and we have to go and fight every.
We've
Yeah,
already conceded that we are
Absolutely.
categorized as Indians not taxed. So
Absolutely.
why are we paying taxes? This is what I'm saying, and if we bring this to the courts, they want to put it somewhere else, they won't adjudicate, they won't do their job. So I maintain that there is no law.
well, I think I would just respond, Sagamore, by saying, you know, that's why we have to push those kinds of avenues. You know, our federally recognized brothers and sisters wouldn't need to push that because tax exemption is encompassed in the recognition process. Whereas we have to push it because we're scraping at all of these existing US systems to try and compensate for the benefits we don't receive by not being recognized. And so we have to push that Indians not taxed element in the court system. And I think it's just a matter of, you know, organizing and strategically doing so. So I'll leave it there.
I'll go Yanaguska, and then I'll add my 2 cents in before we close out.
Yes, please.
I would like to say that, that's a discussion that Lord Thomas and I have been having for at least 6 months. There are a number of countries out there outside of the United States who have already successfully done this, and they operate as a country inside of a country. It took decades, but there's a certain mechanism that we'll discuss in the chief's meeting that moves you through the process and through the UN process to give you that recognition. One of the first steps that we took, and as a requirement to join FANA, is all of the peoples of the individual tribes, as well as all of the lands, we've placed in trust. We placed them in trust by the capital letters. We placed them in trust by the lowercase letters. We've done the old boundaries from the rock to the river in the old language. We've included the hunting grounds. And then we took the principal chiefs as the administrators of the individual trusts. So that was a major first step because that locks us in. Now nothing can be done with those lands. Some of the things that we're going to go over at another time are strategies that other larger confederations have succeeded in accomplishing when dealing with the European powers. And we're going to get more information on that outside of this meeting. But the process is exactly as Dr. Palermo's pointed out, is we're going to move to a status where we are no longer taxable. And our original lands, not somewhere out in the middle of the great beyond, the lands where our ancestors were born and died and the DNA is inside the trees and the grass, those lands will come back to us. And we're on our way to getting them. And I think that the overall strategy that we're all talking about here is the same one. And when it becomes blended and sifted, yes, and we're gonna make a really nice cake with it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I'll just add my last thoughts, just to tie into what everyone else said, because a lot of times I think that we're led to believe that the powers that be don't know what's going on, or that they are somehow operating in a space of illegality under the law. And what we found most times is that they're not. They create whatever's there, but they just don't mention it. And they don't teach you how to get to it. So as we're discussing all of this right now, I just want to point to a federal statute, 8 U.S.C. 1401B. This is nationals and citizens of the United States at birth. And the language says, the following shall be nationals and citizens of the United States at birth. So just stop right there for a lot of people who come from kind of like the sovereign background, where they say, well, I'm not a citizen, I'm a not. No, you're both. 8 U.S.C. 1401B. The following are nationals and citizens. Stay away from the sovereign citizen nonsense. But B, a person born in the United States to a member of an Indian, Eskimo, Aleutian, or other Aboriginal tribes. So calling yourself an Aborigine, Indigenous, that don't get you out of it. If you were born in the United States, and how were we born in the United States? Did you have a birth certificate? You were born in the United States then. So if you got a birth certificate, you're a person born in the United States to a member of an Indian, Eskimo, Aleutian, or other Aboriginal tribe, they are citizens and nationals of the United States. But this is the key language, and this is how we know that they know what they're doing. They're just not going to tell you. Provided that the granting of citizenship under this section, so the Indians are not citizens, but they're granted citizenship, provided that this granting of citizenship under this subsection shall not in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of such person to tribal or other property. Now let me ask, and I'll close it out on this, what's tribal property? Because for me, it's what we put into our trust. That's the dividing line right there. And I'm sure Dr. Diamond will acknowledge, and I'm sure Dr. Palermo will back me up on this. All U.S. federal jurisdiction over Indians is commercial, it's through the Commerce Clause. So right there, you understand why the jurisdiction goes up to the point where you start messing with tribal property, because they don't have any jurisdiction commercially over your tribal property. But if it's not your tribal property, if you didn't know you needed a trust, if you didn't know that you could create a trust, and well, it's U.S. property, and you got no say over it. So
Ignorance of the law.
ignorance of the law is no excuse. And I would just ask, no one has to answer, but how many people had actually ever read the statute that explains why and how Indians are U.S. citizens? And more importantly, if this statute had to be implemented for Indians to be granted U.S. citizenship, what does that mean that they were before and now outside of the U.S. citizenship? So I'll leave my thoughts there. Chiefs, are there any last final remarks before we close out our panel discussion in our conference? Yes, Chief.
I just wanted for the people that don't understand the import of what the doctor's talking about and what Two Hawks is talking about. When you look at a map, and the map, let's say, says Canada in capital letters, that refers to a certain body of water. When it's a capital with lowercase letters, that refers to another body of water. But nowhere, anywhere in the United States or Canada or the Commonwealth do they own the land. The land, has nothing to do with the nation of Canada or the United States. They're claiming water. Traditional native water territory rights are 3.5 miles from the shoreline. So in the case of our tribe in New Jersey, we go clear across Manhattan and all the way out the other side. But they don't tell you that. You can knock on a door and you could be right next door to the right door, and they won't tell you. And the reason that they do these things with the natives, if you look at history, one of the reasons why before any treaty was ever signed with the natives, you had to release the white slaves, the captives. And they didn't take into account that after 7 years they became tribal members. They wanted you to release them because they were the only people that could sue on behalf of the tribe in their courts, because the natives were not viewed as citizens. We never petitioned to be citizens. We were given it and it was shoved down our throat in the 1920s. And there was a legal strategy for them in doing this as well. So there is no accident, as Dr. Diamond pointed out. This is deliberate 3-card Monte. It's a shell game with the P. It's anything you want it to be, but it's exactly what you think it is. And we have to figure out what it is, and that's what we're in the process of doing. So there's a history behind this, and the U.S. is not this great, magnificent bestower of water and land and protection. So what some tribes in other areas neglect to pay attention to is, and I had this discussion with somebody a couple of weeks ago, another chief, and said, what happens if they gave us all back our land? Well, we don't have enough parades to secure it, okay? So it would be somebody who's gonna take it back. And I use this with my council. Sometimes councils want you to move along. And you know exactly what I'm saying, Chief. And my answer to them was, you know, the Dutch came and went, the French came and went, the English came and went, the British came and went, the Americans aren't going anywhere. Okay, so we need to figure out this landmine of a field while reclaiming ours and still being part of it, in the boundaries of North America. And we have to always keep an eye also on the fact that there's 5, 10, 15 generations worth of people who've been here for 400 years that have no idea about gates and locks and all those things, which, you know, the natives aren't available to. So we have an even more delicate dance in not only reclaiming what is rightfully ours and not being sucked into another trust, but also making sure that we don't alienate large swaths of the population because they think we're gonna kick them all out of their houses.
Yeah.
So there's this great overwhelming dynamic that goes into doing this correctly. And that's a better understanding of the state that the last sovereign tribes are in, which requires us to take a little bit more care and get some of our younger chiefs through law school and bring in people like Dr. Diamond and Lord Thomas who have this international view of how it's working in Africa and how it's been handled in Eastern Europe and Singapore and, you know, so we're doing it. But it's going to take a little bit more work, but I think we're well on the way.
And those would be our closing remarks for our panelists today. Round of applause for our panelists. And as usual, with everyone else, I'm gonna ask you not to go anywhere, but I will read these certificates of participation. These certificates are proudly presented to Dr. Taino Palermo and Dr. Ronald Yanabuska Holloway in recognition of their participation in the 5th Annual International Indigenous Peoples Cultural Congress presented the 17th day of April in the year 2021. And the Sagamore already got his, that we wanted to be fair and not give him 2. Already got his. I'll present these to the chiefs. Yes, sir. And then we have one last bit of business to handle. I'm gonna ask Dr. Palermo to come over with me before we close out and I get into my closing remarks. Simply because we did not start this work at the law school just gung-ho getting it all done. We had people who paid attention and supported us. So I'll turn it over to the good doctor.
So I would just say this has been an exciting thing to witness since we first did this in the old Providence campus in
5 years ago.
2016, yeah. And so as this work develops and as we reclaim our heritage, our lands, our rights, it is just an honor and a pleasure to be a part of this. And I see our attendance grow every year. I see our interest grow every year. And I see people becoming refocused and kind of reborn, if you will, of their identities. I think Wampus said it beautifully when he introduced Dr. Bangs. I had that same revelation with the late Cacique Guanaqueu, who was one of our first keynote speakers at our first conference, who was one of the last 5 Taino caciques who actually had over 50% indigenous blood. You know, I know he's looking down on us today and watching this growth and development. And you know, as has been said by this panel here, we are not here to live and see the fruits of our labor. It is for 7 generations in the future. And you know, what we are alive to witness and accomplish is great, and we are grateful for that to the Creator. But this is bigger than all of us, and it's just exciting to be a part of this process and build with my amazing brothers and sisters here. So thank you. I can't thank you enough. Thank you to Roger Williams University and really the late President Don Farish, who's really a cheerleader in the most way possible to open up the pathway for an anchor institution sitting on sacred land to lean into that and not be afraid to embrace that. And we couldn't be more grateful to President Violas for carrying that torch and not dropping the ball whatsoever, but seamlessly, you know, carrying on this torch. And personally, for Ray and I at the law school, former Dean Yonoski, who sat down with us, and Dean Horowitz, who sat down with us before we even went to law school and talked about an Indigenous people's law clinic at the law school. And they sat down with us, they heard us. And then Ray and I were like, you know what, let's just go to law school and do this. And Dean Yonoski paved the way for us, and our new incoming Dean Bowman, just as President Violas did, has carried that torch and needed to even more so to bring Dr. Diamond here and elevate his work. You know, the creator, when the creator bangs on the door, you open that. And we did, and we let the universe, listen to the universe's signs when it was calling. So thank you again, and I just, you know, it's an honor. But
Yeah. First advisor for the American Indian Law Students Association, former dean of the law school, David Logan, who from the very beginning was like, hey, look, I don't know a lot about this. I've had some experience, but this seems like a fantastic initiative you all are pursuing, and I'm supporting you with whatever you need, even up to having conversation with Dr. Diamond and saying to the current dean and other professors and assistant deans, Dr. Diamond should be here. You know, there's no reason Dr. Diamond shouldn't be here. So we want to acknowledge Professor Logan as well, and just the entirety of the Roger Williams University staff, Dr. Charlotte Carrington Palmer, Dr. Diamond, just everyone. They've really embraced us. They are really running with us. And I don't really have much more to say than what the CK here. So, let me have a round of applause for our family. Well, 5:01. Look at that. Look at that.
On time?
Absolutely.
Oh, man.
All of the sachems, the CKs that are in the room right now, I want to acknowledge and honor you all for your time and energy to be here. All of our sachems that are on virtual, I want to say katapatush to you all for being here. We all know in some form or fashion what it's like being a chief. And as Yana Guska said, it's usually a lot of fighting with your counsel because you're not doing something right, or you're not doing something fast enough, and you did something too fast. Whatever the case may be, you're the chief and you should know better. So to all of the chiefs here, I want to honor you all. I want to respect you all. I want to thank you all for your continued contribution to move things forward. To all of our participants for today's conference, I want to thank you all for your energy, your expertise, your knowledge sharing. Because it's these sorts of things that make conferences interesting. I've been to some horrible conferences before, where I was just ready to leave as soon as I got there. And looking in the virtual space out here, I've seen people with us all day, so we must be doing something correct. I also want to extend a big thank you to our Polka family for allowing us into your lands, for allowing us to acknowledge you, for the fact that in Iniski Tumpawag, you still remain. And not only do you remain, but you're thriving. And with all of our support collectively, as you've continued to do, we will all be thriving as well. And we're really going to put this region on the map. And then, of course, I've got to thank my fantastic staff at PCEI, my lovely wife, Jenny, good friend and brother, Globe here. Mr. King, if you're still on the line, just thank you for putting up with me and my crazy visions and thoughts and what we can do and what we can't do. And just for being warriors for the cause.
Good job.
We are going to close out now. I'm going to ask our Polka family, perhaps the Sachem or the Sagamore, if someone would be willing to just close us out with some good words. Oh, okay, very good.
I thought you wanted to close out with prayer, no?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think Jeff's still on.
We're gonna go back to Firehawk?
Yeah.
Okay, me too, Shazza.
I think it's very important that we all stand and give applause to these two gentlemen.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Do a lot of stuff that will never be thanked for, put up with a lot of stuff that you are willing to do because of your leadership. So we thank you.
Yeah.
No.
All right, so we would turn it over to Firehawk, who is on the
Only we,
Yes.
only we.
And on behalf of the Providence Cultural Equity Initiative, Pocono Tribe of Pocono Nation, Roger Williams University, the Wuchiwami Living Culture Collaborative at Roger Williams University, American Indian Law Students Association at Roger Williams University School of Law, the Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas, and the Psalms Heritage Project.
right there.
Thank you all for making this a very successful and enjoyable 5th Annual International Indigenous Peoples Cultural Conference. And I've already tagged at least one presenter for next year. So hopefully in a year from now, we'll be back together and doing something even bigger and more fabulous and celebrating another one of our Indigenous nations here. So with that being said, we'll turn it over to Firehawk to close us out today.
That's all.
Thank you, Creator. We thank you for this day. We thank you that the eyes of our understanding today has truly been opened. We thank you for all the work that you're doing and for everyone that's represented here today. We thank you that your spirit is breathing upon us right now, that we will become everything that you desire us to be. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you for making it to the Indigenous.